The blizzard hit without warning, and so did she. 1 second, Colt Mercer was doing his job. The next, $15,000 of HOA fury was wrapped around his front bumper, and she had the audacity to smile when the lawyer called. The storm had been building since noon, but by 7 that evening it had become something personal. The kind of blizzard that doesn't just fall, it commits. Snow drove sideways across Pinewood Hollow, estates with the focused hostility of something that had scores to settle, and the streets that the residents of that manicured, gated community paid so dearly to maintain had vanished entirely beneath 18 inches of compacted white silence. Colt Mercer had been plowing since 4 in the morning. Not this subdivision specifically. He'd taken on Pinewood Hollow as a contract 3 seasons ago, a decision he sometimes quietly regretted because the residents there had a particular talent for mistaking his professionalism for servitude. But a contract was a contract, and Colt had built Mercer Property Services from a second-hand truck and a maxed-out credit card into a 3-vehicle operation with 6 seasonal employees. And he hadn't done that by walking away from work when it got inconvenient. His F450, a 2019 model with a commercial-grade Fisher plow and amber strobes running the full length of the cab roof, moved through the development's main artery at approximately 8 miles per hour. That was the speed. Not reckless, not lazy. 8 miles per hour, strobes blazing, reverse alarm engaged when he backed up, the truck's massive bulk visible from 300 yards in any direction. He'd done this particular street 40 times over 3 winters. He knew every dip, every crown, every drain that liked to hide under the snow and catch his blade wrong. He also knew, at this point, which houses belonged to which personalities. The beige colonial with the plastic deer figurines belonged to a retired couple named the Fentons, who always left him coffee on the porch in a thermos with a sticky note that said "Thank you, Colt," in wobbly handwriting. The modern farmhouse belonged to a young architect named Devereaux, who never acknowledged Colt's existence, but also never complained. And the showpiece at the end of Pinewood Court, the one with the imported Belgian stone driveway and the motorized gate that was perpetually malfunctioning, belonged to Renata Good. Renata Good, president of the Pinewood Hollow Homeowners Association for the last 4 consecutive years, a position she treated with the gravity typically reserved for heads of state. Renata, who had sent him a written notice in his 2nd season about the angle at which his windrows were being deposited along the curb. Renata, who had once photographed tire tracks in her lawn from 30 feet away and emailed them to him with the subject line, "Evidence, Mercer Truck, February 14th," as though she were filing a federal complaint. Renata, who had been, by any fair measure, the most exhausting client Colt had ever maintained a professional relationship with, and he'd once plowed for a retired military colonel who timed his passes with a stopwatch. But she paid on time, and she'd signed a 3-year contract renewal in October, so here they were. Colt made his 4th pass down Pinewood Court, clearing the center of the road and pushing the accumulation toward the designated windrow zones marked in the HOA's snow removal addendum. Yes, there was an addendum when his radio crackled. His employee, a 23-year-old named Pryor Wills who was running the sidewalk machine 2 streets over, reported that one of the pneumatic tires had gone soft and he was pulling over to assess. "Swap it out if you've got the spare," Colt said. "If not, park it and I'll come around." "Spare's good, give me 20. "Take your time, roads are garbage." He set the radio on the dash and began his approach to the cul-de-sac at the end of Pinewood Court, which required a careful 3-point sequence to turn the long truck around without punching the plow into someone's landscaping. He'd done it 100 times. He downshifted, his strobes cutting amber sweeps through the driving snow, and began the slow backward arc that would position him for the return pass. He never saw her coming. The impact wasn't violent in the movie sense. There was no explosion, no dramatic crumple. What happened was more specific than that. A small crossover SUV, A white Lexus NX that was nearly invisible against the snow came down Pinewood Court at what the responding officer would later estimate at 22 miles per hour, with zero reduction in speed despite the conditions and the strobes, and the fact that an 11,000-pound commercial plow truck was actively occupying the road directly ahead. The Lexus's front left quarter panel connected with the rear driver's side corner of Colt's truck bed with a sound that was more crack than boom, sharp and definitive. And then there was the grinding lurch of metal dragging metal, and then silence except for the wind. Colt had the truck in park and his door open before the silence fully settled. He came around the back of his truck with a flashlight in his hand, his heart doing something complicated in his chest, and found the Lexus sitting at a 30-degree angle with its hood crumpled backward and steam beginning to lift from somewhere underneath. The driver's side window was already going down. Renata Good looked at him from behind the glass. She was wearing a fur-trimmed coat, and her hair was immaculate in the way that suggested she'd been inside somewhere warm until about 3 minutes ago. Her expression cycled rapidly through several phases: surprise, assessment, and then, with a speed that genuinely startled him, indignation. "Your truck," she said, "was blocking the road." Colt stood in the snow and looked at her. "Ms. Good, are you hurt?" "My car is destroyed." "Are you hurt?" She opened her door and stepped out onto the snow-packed street in heeled boots that were absolutely wrong for the conditions, looked at the front of her Lexus with the expression of someone who had just been personally betrayed by the universe, and said, "You reversed into me." "I was turning around in the cul-de-sac," he said. "I've been turning around in that cul-de-sac every storm for 3 years. My strobes have been running continuously. There are 4 amber lights on my roof and 2 on the plow blade." It was dark. "That's what the lights are for." She turned to look at him with an expression that had calcified into something cold and deliberate. "This happened on HOA property, which your truck was servicing under a contract that I oversee. You will want to be very careful about your tone right now." Colt pulled out his phone and began filming. Not aggressively, just steadily, capturing the scene, the position of both vehicles, the visible tire tracks in the snow. The strobe still running on his truck, the damage to her quarter panel and hood. He'd learned years ago that documentation was the only language that mattered when things went wrong in Pinewood Hollow. He called 911 and requested a police report, which he knew from experience Renata would prefer he didn't do. She watched him make the call with an expression like a closing door. The officer who responded was a young woman named Sergeant Dana Pelham, who had clearly been having a long night already, but who approached the scene with the quiet competence of someone who had seen enough winter accidents to read one in about 45 seconds. She took statements from both parties, photographed both vehicles, noted the position of Colt's strobes in her report, and observed, with careful neutrality, that the Lexus's tire tracks showed no signs of braking before impact. Renata disputed this with 4 separate interruptions. Sergeant Pelham wrote the accident report. She did not issue any citations, though she noted in her documentation that the F-450 had been operating in full compliance with visible warning requirements and that the Lexus had failed to maintain safe speed for conditions. She handed both parties their copies and left. Colt went back to work. He finished Pinewood Court, finished the main loop, cleared the 3 cul-de-sacs, and had the development fully plowed by 11:15. He did not see Renata again that night. He got home at midnight, made himself a bowl of cereal because it was all he had energy for, and sat at his kitchen table going through the photographs he'd taken at the scene. Damage to his truck was minor: a dented rear corner of the bed, some scratched paint. His equipment was built to absorb punishment. The Lexus had not fared as well. He pulled up his insurance app, documented everything, and sent it to his agent with a note that read, "Not at fault. Full documentation attached. Officer report number included." He went to bed. He did not, at that point, have any particular anxiety about the situation. He had lights, He had a report, he had documentation, and he hadn't done anything wrong. He understood that Renata Good was difficult and that she would likely push back in some form, but he dealt with difficult clients before. He thought the worst of it was probably behind him. He was incorrect. The letter arrived 12 days later, on a Thursday, in an envelope bearing the return address of a law firm called Whitmore, Hartley and Slade. It was written in the careful, expensive language of people who are paid to make ordinary aggression sound like legal inevitability, and what it communicated was this. Renata Good, acting in her capacity as HOA board president and as a private individual, was pursuing a claim against Mercer Property Services for damages resulting from what the letter characterized as negligent operation of a commercial vehicle within a residential zone. The claimed damages were itemized. Vehicle repair, $14,200. Personal distress and related medical evaluation, $3,000. Loss of use of vehicle, $1,400. Miscellaneous documented expenses, $812. Total, $19,412. At the bottom of the letter, in language so smooth it practically gleamed, was an offer. If Mercer Property Services agreed to the following terms: payment of the claimed damages, issuance of a formal written apology, and voluntary termination of the current HOA service contract, the matter could be resolved without further legal action. Colt read the letter twice at his kitchen table. Then he set it down. Then he picked it up and read it a third time to make sure he'd understood the termination clause correctly. They didn't just want money. They wanted him gone. They wanted him to pay them, apologize, and then remove himself from the contract he'd signed in good faith, a contract that had 3 years of performance behind it, that had been renewed voluntarily in October, that he had never once violated. He went to his desk, opened the drawer where he kept physical copies of his contracts, pulled out the Pinewood Hollow Agreement, and read through Section 14, which covered dispute resolution, and Section 22, which covered termination. Then he called his cousin Nadia, who was not a lawyer but who was sharp in the way that people who have had to fight for everything they have tend to be sharp, and read her the relevant sections over the phone. "They can't terminate you for cause without documented service failures," Nadia said. "I know. And the accident report says you weren't at fault." "I know that too." "So what they're doing," she said, "is trying to bully you into quitting so they don't have to pay the buyout." The contract included a termination without cause clause. If the HOA chose to end the agreement before its expiration, they owed Mercer Property Services the equivalent of 40% of the remaining contract value. With 2 years and 4 months left and a contract worth $62,000 annually, that number was not small. "They're also trying to flip the liability," Colt said. "If I admit fault by paying, it protects her from anything her own insurance might do." "Yeah," Nadia said, "you need a lawyer." He called 3. He met with one, a compact, precise woman named Eleanor Marsh, whose office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, and who listened to his account, reviewed the police report, examined the photos, and read the demand letter with the patient attention of someone disassembling something to understand how it was built. "The accident report is the cornerstone," Eleanor said. "Failure to reduce speed for conditions. No pre-impact braking. Your strobes were documented as operational. This is a weak claim dressed in expensive paper. Can they make it stick?" "Not if you fight it. The question is what you want. Do you want to resolve this quietly, or do you want to resolve it correctly?" Colt thought about the 3 winters he'd spent in that subdivision, about the thermos of coffee from the Fentons, about Pryor and his other employees who depended on those contracts being intact, about what it would mean, not just financially but in terms of who he was and what he'd built, to write a check and an apology for something he hadn't done. "Correctly," he said. Eleanor Marsh nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Then we respond to the letter, and then we wait for them to decide how serious they actually are. The response went out 5 days later. It was 4 pages long. It declined all claims. It cited the accident report, the photographic documentation, the strobes, the officer's observations, the contractual language governing dispute resolution. And in a section that a liener had composed with particular care, it noted that any attempt to use the HOA's board authority to pressure or coerce a vendor into accepting false liability would constitute a separate actionable claim. It also included, as an exhibit, a calculation of the early termination fee that would be owed to Mercer Property Services if the HOA chose to end the contract prematurely without documented cause. $87,200. Colt signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and handed it to a liener's assistant to send. He drove home through streets that were dry now, the storm long dissolved, and told himself that whatever came next, he'd done everything right. His phone rang that night at 8:47, unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Renata Good's voice, stripped of its usual HOA president composure, and what it said was short and unambiguous. This isn't over. He saved the recording, forwarded it to a liener, and went to bed. He slept better than he expected to. What Colt didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Renata Good had made the same call she always made when she wanted something done. She'd gone to the HOA board. And the board, which consisted of 4 homeowners who had varying degrees of actual investment in the situation, had agreed in a closed meeting to authorize the legal action on the HOA's behalf, which meant that the costs of pursuing it were being billed not to Renata personally, but to the association's operational budget. To every homeowner in Pinewood Hollow, including the Fentons, including the young architect Devereaux, including the 11 other families who had never asked for any of this. That meeting had not been disclosed in the meeting minutes posted to the HOA portal. The vote had not been properly documented, and one of the 4 board members, a quiet software engineer named Marcus Obi, who lived in the house with the green shutters on Briarwood Lane, had not actually agreed with the decision, had in fact objected to it, and had been told by Renata that his objection was noted but the majority ruled. Marcus Obi, as it happened, had a neighbor. Her name was Josephine Tran, and she was a paralegal at a firm that specialized in community association law, and she had very specific opinions about HOA boards authorizing legal expenditures without proper disclosure to membership. Colt didn't know any of this yet, but Marcus Obi was about to make a phone call of his own. The legal standoff entered its 2nd month with the particular grinding quality of things that are unresolved, but also not nothing. Eleanor Marsh continued to represent Mercer Property Services with the composed ferocity of someone who genuinely enjoyed this kind of work. Whitmore, Hartley, and Slade sent 2 additional letters, both of which were met with responses that declined their positions with increasing specificity. The claimed damages didn't grow, but the language around them became more elaborate, which Eleanor said was a sign that they were reinforcing a weak structure rather than building a strong one. Colt kept working. He plowed Pinewood Hollow through 2 more storms in January because his contract obligated him to, and because, more than that, he refused to give Renata the satisfaction of watching him disappear. He did his job with exactly the professionalism he'd always brought to it. He documented each visit. He photographed his truck strobes at the start and end of every shift. He logged his arrival and departure times. He was meticulous in a way that had nothing to do with paranoia, and everything to do with the particular dignity of a man who knows he's being watched and chooses to do his best work anyway. Pryor noticed. "You're logging everything down to the minute," he said one night, watching Colt fill out the service record. "Always have." "More than usual." "Probably," Colt said. "You got a problem with it." Pryor shook his head. "Nope, just saying it's impressive." It was during the second January storm that Colt first encountered Marcus Obie. He was finishing the Briarwood Lane loop when a man in a gray down coat came out of one of the houses and walked toward the truck with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided to do something they've been thinking about for a while. Colt rolled down the window. Marcus Obie was 41 years old, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his professional life looking for logical inconsistencies. He introduced himself, mentioned that he lived in the house with the green shutters, and said, without preamble, "I was on the board vote that authorized the legal action against you." Colt kept his expression neutral. "Okay. I voted against it. I want you to know that. I also want you to know that the vote wasn't properly disclosed to the membership, and the meeting minutes are inaccurate." A pause stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind and the idling engine. "My neighbor is a paralegal," Marcus continued. "She says that using association funds to pursue a claim that primarily benefits the board president, specifically to protect her from personal liability for an accident that wasn't your fault, is a breach of fiduciary duty." "I've heard that term recently," Colt said. "I imagine you have." Marcus looked at him steadily. "I'm not here to get involved in your legal situation. I'm here because my neighbors are paying for something they didn't approve and don't know about, and that bothers me more than I can adequately express." Colt nodded slowly. "What are you planning to do about it?" "I've already requested a special membership meeting under Section 9.4 of our governing documents. I need 30% of homeowners to co-sign the request. I have 27%. I need 3 more households." "I can't help you with that. I'm not a homeowner." "No," Marcus said, "but the Fentons are, and they've been asking questions about where their HOA fees went this quarter." He paused. "I thought you'd want to know that there are people in this neighborhood who aren't on her side." He went back inside. Colt sat in the truck for a moment with the engine running, then picked up his phone and called Eleanor. "Someone's moving against the board from inside the HOA," he said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's not uncommon when boards overreach. It doesn't directly affect your case, but it might affect their willingness to continue funding it." "What do I do?" "Nothing. You don't touch it. You don't encourage it. You don't engage with the homeowners about it. You don't make it part of your strategy. You let it be what it is, which is separate from your situation." "Even if it helps me." "Especially if it helps you," Eleanor said. "The cleaner you stay, the stronger your position." He put the phone down and finished the loop. 3 weeks later, the special membership meeting happened. Colt wasn't there. It wasn't his meeting to attend, but Eleanor sent him a text the evening it occurred that read, "Sources say attendance was substantial. Renata had a difficult night." What had happened, as Colt pieced it together from Marcus's subsequent account and from what eventually became part of the public record, was this: 41 homeowners had attended the special meeting, which represented 63% of the association's membership. Marcus had presented the undisclosed legal expenditure, $11,400 of HOA funds spent on Whitmore, Hartley, and Slade over 8 weeks, along with the improperly documented board vote and the meeting minutes that had omitted the dissenting vote and the full context of the expenditure. The homeowners had questions. Renata had answers, but they were the kind of answers that generated more questions. Someone asked why the HOA was funding legal action for what appeared to be a personal auto accident. Someone else asked why the membership hadn't been notified before funds were committed. The Fentons, Harold and Vera, 71 and 68, with their wobbly handwriting and their thermos of coffee, asked why the Plow company they'd had no complaints about was being sued for an accident that the police report indicated wasn't his fault. Renata said the HOA had an interest in vendor accountability. Harold Fenton said, in the deliberate way of a man who had spent 40 years saying things carefully and meaning every word, "Ms. Good, We pay you to run this association, not to use it. The room had gone very quiet after that. The motion to halt further HOA expenditure on the legal matter passed with 34 votes in favor, 5 against, and 2 abstentions. A second motion was raised, not by Marcus, who had the good political sense to let it come from someone else, calling for a formal review of the board president's use of association funds. That motion passed with 31 votes. The following morning, Whitmore, Hartley and Slade sent Eleanor Marsh a brief communication stating that their client was reassessing her position and requesting a 30-day pause in proceedings. Eleanor called Colt. They're looking for an exit. How do we help them find it? We don't, she said. We let them come to us. And when they do, we tell them exactly what resolution looks like. What resolution looked like, as Eleanor drafted it, was not vindictive. It didn't need to be. It was simply precise. Renata Good, in her personal capacity, would withdraw all claims against Mercer Property Services. The HOA would issue a formal written acknowledgement, not an apology, just an acknowledgement, that the legal action had been improperly funded through association resources. The HOA would reimburse itself by seeking recovery from Renata personally for the $11,400 expended on her behalf, and the Mercer Property Services contract would continue unmodified through its remaining term. There was one additional element that Eleanor had added at Colt's specific request, and which she had thought about carefully before including: a clause requiring that the resolution letter be shared with the full HOA membership in the next regular newsletter. You want them to know it's over, Eleanor said. I want them to know it was wrong, Colt said. There's a difference. Renata's attorney called back 4 days before the 30-day pause expired. The conversation with Eleanor lasted 11 minutes. The settlement agreement was signed 6 days after that. Colt was in his truck when Eleanor called to confirm. He was doing an estimate on a new commercial account across town, a medical office park that needed a seasonal contract. He pulled into a parking lot to take the call, and when Eleanor said it's done, he sat with that for a moment before he said anything back. All of it, he asked. All of it, claims withdrawn, contract intact, reimbursement clause included. The newsletter item goes out with the March HOA bulletin. He thanked her. He meant it in the specific way you mean things when they've cost you something real, not just money, which the legal fees had been, but time and energy, and the low-grade weight of having someone try to rewrite a story you knew was true. He sat in the parking lot for another minute. The day was clear and cold, the kind of winter day that comes after a storm has fully moved through, when the sky goes that particular shade of hard blue and everything seems clean and final. His phone buzzed. A text from Pryor, 6 inches forecast Thursday. I'll be at the yard by 3. He wrote back, good. Make sure the Fisher blade on the 450 is greased. That rear corner still has a scuff. He put the truck in drive and went to do the estimate. The March HOA newsletter arrived in the Pinewood Hollow mailboxes on a Friday. The item was on page 3, below the reminder about the spring landscaping guidelines and above the notice about the pool opening schedule. It was 4 sentences long. It named the expenditure. It named the resolution. It did not name Renata Good directly. That had been a negotiated point. But it described the board president's role clearly enough that the omission of her name was a formality that fooled no one. The Fentons read it over breakfast, and Vera sent Colt a text message that his number had somehow ended up in her contacts despite the fact that they'd never exchanged messages before. The text said, "We're glad it worked out. The coffee will be on the porch Thursday." Colt read it at his kitchen table and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized had been tight. Renata Good did not run for re-election to the HOA board that spring. The announcement came via a brief email to the membership citing personal scheduling conflicts. Marcus Obie was elected to the open seat with 44 votes. the highest individual total in the association's 12-year history of elections. He sent Colt a professional, neutral message through the HOA's vendor portal, confirming that the service contract terms remained unchanged and that Mercer Property Services was valued by the association. Colt saved that message in the same folder where he kept the accident photos, the police report, the attorney correspondence, and the signed settlement agreement. He labeled the folder with a date and a single word: resolved. He went to work on Thursday. There were 6 inches in the forecast and a full route to run and a truck that needed its blade checked before sunrise. He pulled out of his yard at 3:45 in the morning with Pryor behind him in the second truck, both sets of amber strobes cutting the darkness, and drove toward Pinewood Hollow the same way he'd driven toward it every storm for 3 years, professionally, carefully, and without apology. The snow came down clean and steady. The roads were open ahead of him. He set the blade to the pavement, felt the familiar resistance, and pushed forward into the dark.